You know, the country you live in, with its borders, its flag, its whole identity, it feels so permanent, right? Like it's been here forever. But what if I told you it's actually a pretty new idea? Almost an accidental invention in the grand story of humanity. Let's get into how the world of countries we take for granted actually came to be. But before we do, just stop for a second and try to picture that. A world with no countries, no passports, no national teams, none of this stuff we're used to. It's kind of hard to even wrap your head around, isn't it? That's because the nation-state has become the default setting for the entire planet. But it wasn't always this way. Not even close.
Okay, so to really understand this, we've got to break down the term itself. A nation-state is really two separate ideas smashed together. First, you've got the nation. That's the people. It's a feeling, a community of folks who share a culture, a language, a history. Then you have the state. That's the political hardware, the government, the actual territory, the laws, and the power to enforce them. The real story, the interesting part, is how those two things got fused into one.
So, if this is all a relatively new idea, what on earth was here before it? Well, for most of human history, political life looked completely different.
Before the nation-state, the world was this wild mosaic of different ways to organize people. You had ancient city-states, each one its own little world. You had these massive, sprawling, multi-ethnic empires, like the Romans or the Ottomans, that ruled over dozens of different cultures. And in much of Europe, power was super local, down to the level of feudal lords and their lands.
And here's the really crucial difference to get. In a feudal world, your loyalty wasn't to some abstract idea like Italy or Spain. It was personal. You swore an oath to your local lord, the guy who owned the land and offered you protection. Your whole world might just be a day's walk in any direction. The concept of being a citizen connected by law to millions of strangers you'd never meet, that was still way, way off in the future.
I mean, just look at this map of Europe from 1600. It's not a neat map of countries. It's a chaotic, overlapping patchwork of little kingdoms, duchies, and big empires. Borders were fuzzy, and they shifted all the time. Your identity came from your village, your religion, or your lord, not from your nation.
So how did we get from that messy map to the world we recognize today? Well, the change didn't happen peacefully. It was born out of a period of unbelievable violence that pretty much forced Europe to come up with a whole new system.
The event that changed everything was the 30 Years' War, and it's honestly hard to overstate how devastating this was. We're talking an estimated 8 to 12 million deaths from fighting, famine, and disease. In some parts of Germany, over a third of the entire population was gone. This was more than a war. It was a complete societal breakdown that screamed for a new way of doing things.
So, the war kicked off as a religious fight, Protestants versus Catholics inside the messy Holy Roman Empire. But it spiraled out of control and became a continent-wide political slugfest, with kingdoms like France and Sweden jumping in to gain power and weaken their rivals. After 3 decades of absolute carnage, everyone was exhausted, and they finally came together to sign the Peace of Westphalia.
Now, this treaty laid out a few really revolutionary ideas that are basically the foundation of our world today. The biggest one was sovereignty. The idea that each ruler gets to be the boss in their own territory, full stop. And that meant other countries had to stay out of their business. This was the birth of the modern state system.
But hold on a minute. The Peace of Westphalia gave us the idea of sovereign states. You could think of it as creating the container. But it didn't give us the nation, that sense of a unified people to fill the container. For that piece of the puzzle, we need to jump forward another century and a half.
And this brings us to the next massive turning point in our story. We're heading to France, where a revolution wasn't just going to overthrow a king, it was going to completely rewire the whole idea of what a country is.
Before the revolution, it was simple. The king was the state. But the revolutionaries flipped that on its head. They said power doesn't come from a king, it comes from the people. All of a sudden, you weren't just a subject who belonged to a monarch. You were a citizen who was part of the French nation. And this powerful new idea was cemented with symbols, a national flag, a national anthem, and a new kind of army made of citizens fighting for their homeland, not just for a paycheck from a king.
And this idea, nationalism, was incredibly contagious. It spread like wildfire across Europe. People who shared a language or a culture started thinking, hey, we should have our own state too. This is the energy that eventually fueled the unifications of all those little German and Italian states into the countries of Germany and Italy that we know today.
Okay, so the story seems pretty simple, right? Westphalia makes the state, the French Revolution makes the nation, and boom, the model spreads.
But, as it always is with history, the real story is a lot more complicated and a whole lot messier.
First of all, we have to recognize that this model didn't just spread because it was a good idea. It was often forced on the rest of the world through European colonialism. Europeans drew lines on maps all over Africa and Asia that created countries, but often ignored the actual nations and peoples who lived there, causing problems that are still with us today.
And second, that whole story about Westphalia creating neat, tidy states, it needs a second look. So on the left, you see Europe before the war in 1600. On the right, Europe after the peace in 1660. The popular story is that this treaty created unified states, but I want you to look really closely at the center of that map.
As historian Luis Moita points out, the reality was exactly the opposite. For the Holy Roman Empire, which was at the heart of the war, Westphalia didn't create a unified Germany, it shattered it. By giving hundreds of tiny princes more power, it basically broke Central Europe into even smaller pieces, which actually delayed German unification for another 200 years.
So the real takeaway is this. There wasn't some magical switch flipped in 1648 where the modern world suddenly popped into existence. The rise of the nation-state was a slow, uneven, messy process that happened differently all over Europe over the course of centuries.
And all of that brings us right up to the present day. For the last couple hundred years, the nation-state has been the main player on the world stage. But is its time running out?
Today, the power of the nation-state is being challenged from all sides. You've got globalization, where huge corporations operate across borders, sometimes becoming more powerful than the countries themselves. You have organizations like the European Union, where countries voluntarily give up some of their sovereignty. And you have global problems, like pandemics or climate change, that just don't care about our lines on a map.
Which leaves us with this huge, fascinating question. For the last few centuries, the nation-state has been the main character of our global story. But in a world that's more connected and facing more global problems than ever before, is this accidental invention, born from European wars and revolutions, still the best way to run things? Or are we watching it slowly become